Fair warning, there will be mature content shown on screen. I want to take a look at an example of the use of fear to make a game more interesting. How we as consumers of media enjoy the use of fear to create more exciting experiences, and how in the gaming world it's used to keep a player invested for longer. But the experience also needs to be controllable to a point. When you're reading a scary book, you can always just skip a page. Watching a movie, you can cover your eyes. So how do we get through a scary part of a game if we have to keep our eyes open and can't skip ahead? Let's find out. To do this, I'm going to focus on a title called Dying Light, which is a first-person action survival game set in a post-apocalyptic open world overrun by zombies. In Dying Light, you roam a city devastated by a mysterious virus epidemic, and you scavenge for supplies, craft weapons, and face hordes of the infected. Sounds a little bit too relevant. The game released 5 years ago on PC, Xbox, PlayStation 4 and Linux, and after a fairly poor launch, the game was overhauled and updated several times by the developer Techland to the point that it's become one of the best experiences of its generation. Before we talk about how fear makes things more interesting, we need to understand what those things are. So let's take a quick peek behind the core gameplay elements that make up Dying Light. The first element that makes Dying Light an interesting and enjoyable experience is its world is actually a truly open world. What I mean by that is the buildings have interiors, not just exteriors. This may sound trivial, but as the player, this adds to the sense of realism. It's much easier to suspend disbelief, something that makes gameplay much more interesting, if you can interact with the environments in a more complete sense. If your environment is full of buildings but you can't go inside any of them, then they don't feel like buildings anymore, they feel like shells. Complementing the open world elements is how you move inside the world. Open world has almost become the default setting for games these days, but the issue holding them back is traversing these worlds is largely, well, boring for the most part. A boring gameplay element removes you, the player, from the game mentally and has you wondering when the enjoyment is going to return. This does not make games interesting, so if the developers can make moving through the world interesting, then they can keep you engaged as you travel from one location to another. This is what Dying Light achieves with its parkour movement. Yes, you still need to get from A to B to complete C, but instead of just running in relatively straight lines or riding a horse set to autopilot, you now have choice and options as to how you're going to get there. Are you going to run through the streets and attempt to dodge all of the zombies? Are you going to take the safer option and stay up as high as possible, jumping from rooftop to rooftop? Are you going to use your grappling hook? It's entirely up to you as the player. And so as the game continues, you get better at making these decisions, you improve the way you move through the world, and this interesting movement element forces you to stay engaged as you traverse the world, keeping you focused and ultimately enjoying the experience more than the default alternatives.
Lonely, I'm Mr. Lonely.
This isn't the first game to use parkour. Games that spring to mind with a first-person perspective include Mirror's Edge, a game that revolves almost entirely around this mechanic, and Titanfall 2, a game that is incredibly underrated and enjoyable for similar reasons here. The differences with Titanfall 2 being the single-player game is much shorter, try 20% of Dying Light's, and where Titanfall 2 excels in its movement mechanic, it ultimately is a first-person shooter, which doesn't seem to complement the parkour mechanics quite as well as Dying Light's choice of predominantly melee combat. This leads us into the main gameplay loop of Dying Light: fight, scavenge, and craft. The fighting features largely melee-based combat, which makes for some visceral moments, to say the least. This game has a "we're just trying to make it in this crazy world" vibe, and the combat enhances this with a gritty, messy, and overall in-your-face experience. Scavenging and crafting also fit very well into a post-apocalyptic scenario. And with the realism added by the aforementioned, the game really makes you care about searching high and low for random everyday items to patch together medkits, better weapons, and new equipment that might make surviving that little bit easier. Or maybe just more entertaining. Character progression in the game is fairly straightforward as well. If you want to get better at something, you do that thing, and the game rewards you for it. Want to get better at running? Okay, start running. You'll gain experience in that field, and you'll be able to upgrade those elements after achieving enough experience. This is a good way to reward a player for doing what they enjoy, and to have something to work towards. I finished the game's story and my character's level was around 20 out of 250, so there's a little bit of headroom for growth there. It's fair to say that the game could be considered complete at this point. You've got an interesting world that's fun to move around in, and you've got a satisfying and entertaining gameplay loop that will keep the player immersed in the scenario. But this is where using fear is going to make things interesting. When you first start the game, you're playing in the daylight hours and you're adjusting to the parkour movement. You're becoming acquainted with the zombies and how you can fight them or avoid them altogether. The early game zombies are slow, mindless, and generally not that scary at all. And you are nimble and much more capable than they are. The game makes you feel like you have the upper hand. An hour or two into the game though, the player is introduced into a very different environment when the sun goes down. The sounds that the zombies are making are new and they're scary. It's like nighttime has changed them into something much worse. The music chimes in and starts playing something to get the heart going. This is like the first time you heard the zombies in I Am Legend. This is goosebump-inducing, heart-racing, sweaty palms scary. Just listen to this. It's also pitch black outside. With only a flashlight, you have a very narrow view, which makes the situation scarier because you know you can't see things coming outside your field of view. And then the zombies change. There's another breed of zombie called volatiles, which actively hunts you, which is a big shift. Previously, the zombies would walk slowly after you, and all you would need to do is stand on top of a car and they'd just stand and wait for you to get down. These volatiles can climb, jump, and run, and they're faster than you, and they can do more damage than you can do to them. You have immediately lost your upper hand. The best thing you can do is run from these things and hide, and hope that you don't trip on something because they'll end you in an instant. And when you run, all you can hear is the sound of them behind you, the music amping you up and your character puffing and heaving trying to get away. If you die, you lose a certain amount of character progression, so you really don't want to die, even simply from a gameplay perspective. That and being hunted by a volatile is actually terrifying. You're a fully grown adult who is like an 8-year-old afraid of the dark. The fear is now real. You can retreat to a safe house, which is a makeshift area which you can use to rest and recover from the night's activities without fear of being attacked. You can go to sleep until daybreak, which I recommend because even inside the safe house, you can still hear the volatiles roaming around outside. This is the point where fear has made things interesting. The game has established two very different environments that simply come and go with the rising and setting sun, hence Dying Light.
He said it! He said it!
On my first playthrough, after being subjected to my first overnight escapade, I didn't dare venture out at night for the longest time. I would explore the open world during daylight hours, and I would actively plan my return to a safe house just prior to nighttime to ensure that I didn't get caught. You even get a little alarm that goes off on your watch to tell you nighttime is fast approaching. There is a tension at work here that makes all of the other elements of the game even better. because the use of fear has changed the way in which you play the game. It helps to keep you immersed in the world. It makes the post-apocalyptic scenario mean something new altogether. You now look at the world around you through a lens of safe and unsafe. The unfamiliar parts have become risky, something to be mitigated, avoided, tiptoed around. The fear makes you think about your available quests and their locations and weigh up with the time you've got left that day what you might achieve. You ask yourself a million questions. Will I have enough time to get there? Will I be able to complete the quest before nighttime? Will I be too far from the safe house when I do? What kind of creatures am I going to find? What will I do if I need to run? Because you now know that things can change so quickly, you need to constantly evaluate the world around you. And this immersion is what an actual post-apocalyptic scenario might actually feel like. You have fallen completely into the scenario, and the game has taken you there by leveraging fear to make it all plausible. The fear has emphasized the need for effective movement in the world. You need to practice jumping over things, grabbing onto ledges, so that you can perform when you really need to. It's one thing to run through the world jumping over cars and climbing up walls. It's another thing entirely when you're being hunted. The fear has motivated your search for new materials, so that you can craft new items that are going to help you even up the balance between you and the creatures of the night. All of the core elements that make the game enjoyable to begin with are made even more interesting, simply by introducing the player to a controlled amount of fear. However, the game respects the player's wishes. If you don't wish to venture out at night, you really don't have to. You can play almost the entire game without it, but the game offers you rewards for the risk of going out at night. All player progression experience is doubled. The developers are trying to entice you out. And as I progressed in the game, I built the confidence I needed to do that. Sometimes I died, but other times I managed to stay alive. Either way, I learned a few things and my confidence grew. I became better at the game because I had to learn the best ways to fight the volatiles. I had to find the best locations that would give me an advantage, and I had to try to even up the playing field. All of these things have kept me in the game, kept me playing, and kept me enjoying what I believe to be one of the best survival action games of the generation. If you haven't yet played Dying Light and you like the idea of free running through a post-apocalyptic zombie world and being a little bit scared some of the time and a lot scared once or twice, then I can't recommend this game more highly. If you can think of another game that uses an interesting mechanic, feel free to let me know. Thanks for watching. If you're new to the channel, then you can subscribe and like below if you want to see more of this thing. The best way to help me out is to share my videos with others you think will enjoy them. Otherwise, it's been a pleasure. Be good to your friends and family. Ciao.